been exhausted. That's bad news. Now let's talk to Niall Dickson. He's the Chief Executive of the NHS Confederation. Good morning, Neil. Hello? Are you there?
Morning. Hello?
There you are. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Okay, well, great to speak to you. Many, many moons ago, we were both colleagues on the BBC. There we go. And now life has moved on. Neil, let me ask you, first of all, what is your response to this news from some NHS trusts that they're going to run out of fully protective gowns in the next 24 to 48 hours?
Well, I think that level of concern has been around for a few days, that people are very much hand to mouth, and they are saying, well, we expect we'll get a delivery tomorrow morning, but we don't know how much it'll be or whether it'll be enough. I think at the centre, there was concern in Thursday, Friday that they would actually run out over this weekend. I think there's a little bit more confidence that we might be able to get through this weekend, but I'm not certain about that. It's just there is a higher degree of confidence that they will have enough to cope. But then that raises the question of, during the following week, could we then be back in that situation again? Because we are relying on stuff that is coming largely from China, but also from elsewhere. And sometimes what arrives at national level is not what they'd expected. And then they've got to obviously quality test it and so forth as well. So I think the situation is a crisis at the moment. Our view is that the government were right and Public Health England were right to issue new guidance so that people at least knew if they ran out, and still hopefully they won't, if they ran out, what could they do that is at least recommended for emergencies by the World Health Organization and the Center for Disease Control in the US, and that's what they have issued over this period. I think our big fear is that this will raise anxiety and reduce confidence among staff that was only starting to be rebuilt when they reissued the PPE guidance a couple of weeks ago.
So just to be clear, Neil, if you're a doctor or a nurse and you're listening to this program and you do not get the fully protective gowns that you expect to have this weekend because supplies have run out and you're unlucky, what should you do? Should you still turn up for work or not?
We should certainly turn up for work, because there are lots of things that can be done, as it were, within hospitals and within shifts. I think the question is, do you put yourself into a situation where you're dealing with patients who you would normally have to wear the full PPE gear?
Right. But that's what I meant by that question. Should you put yourself in a position, even without that fully protective gear?
Yeah. I certainly don't think that any hospital would be forcing any member of staff to do that. I think it is reasonable, I think, for hospitals to say, for example, in relation to the standard guidance, this is the right PPE kit for this particular situation, and if an individual member of staff has got a problem with it, then they can talk to them about that and so forth. But there would be normally an expectation that if you have the right PPE kit and you're trained and can work in that area, you can do it. In this emergency situation, I don't think you can expect people to do it. What you have to do is have a discussion. They have to have an understanding of what level of protection they are being offered, what the hospital has in terms of alternatives. Some of those alternatives are, according to WHO, equivalent to what is provided, and of course, but it's a different thing, and of course PPE is not the only way in which, of course, you protect yourself in those circumstances. So I think it has to be a discussion at local level, an understanding of what there is available in this emergency situation, and then individuals will have to make that decision. But I don't think anybody should be forced into that situation if they are not confident about what they're doing.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Because producing a plastic gown, the kind that the NHS needs, is much less complicated than making a ventilator. But in both these cases, perhaps especially with the gowns, we are seeing now the shortcomings of global supply chains at a time of global crisis, are we not?
Exactly that. And of course, China, which has been the great producer of this, shut down for a while. They are now producing again. But of course, now there is a huge global demand for these things. And although they aren't as complicated as a ventilator, they're not there are agents that form the fluid repellent stuff, which is apparently not that easy to get hold of, and that's why, although we are starting to produce stuff within this country, there are still difficulties in making sure that whatever we produce, meets the required standards and so forth. And indeed, of course, what this emergency guidance talks about is, in effect, wearing a fluid repellent thing over the top of the gown that you're wearing to make sure that the droplets don't get infected.
And what would that fluid repellent thing look like? Are we talking about raincoats here? I mean, give us some idea, practical idea.
The normal gown would be what you've seen on television lots of times, with people putting on that full PPE kit. The alternative stuff that they're talking about, and there's a range of things that they're talking about. Some of it is stuff, for example, that's used in laboratories by laboratory technicians who are actually handling COVID. So again, it is obviously meant to work. Some of it is about wearing a gown which is for a different sort of purpose but has equal value. Then some of it is about wearing a gown which is not as fluid repellent, but putting an apron over yourself in order to be able to make sure that you are fluid repellent while you're doing that, and still wearing gloves and so forth in order to protect. But nobody is saying these are absolutely, they're not satisfactory, because they're not the guidance. They're what to do in an emergency. And in that emergency, as I say, I think you will have to have discussions at local level with individuals about, am I satisfied that I am sufficiently protected in order to be able to provide this treatment? And hopefully we won't. Right. It'll be very exceptional, and hopefully it won't happen at all. But, we are in a crisis. There's no question of that.
Well, yeah, we know that. Certainly. Matt Hancock yesterday, the Health Secretary, said that he can't just wave a magic wand and make all these things appear, out of thin air. When you heard him use the words magic wand, and when you remember how long we've known about the approach of this crisis in terms of months, do you think that he was right to use that language?
Wouldn't really want to comment on whether magic. I mean, what he's saying is that he can't. He would like to produce all these gowns, and he's not able to do that, and that's absolutely a statement of fact. And I think there are strenuous efforts, obviously, going on to try and get these materials as quickly as we can. I think at some point, and it's probably, I don't think it is now, we will need to ask what decisions were made at what point. Was there any point where we could have ordered more of this stuff at an earlier stage and have got hold of it, remembering, of course, that China was in a lockdown, so there may have been difficulties. And the original stockpiles that we put forward weren't for this kind of a pandemic. They were for a flu pandemic. And of course, the difference between COVID and flu is that these kinds of very high-end PPE protection equipment would not have been required for a flu epidemic in these numbers. So that's why the national stockpile didn't work, in a sense. There are all sorts of other questions about, how it operates, how it distributes and so forth. But certainly, I think there will be questions needing to be asked, and rightly so, when we move on. I think the moment now is to concentrate on making sure that we do everything possible to make sure that people get the right equipment at the right time. And as I say, if there is an outage, as it were, that you don't have it, that there has to be a discussion at local level about what do we have and what can we do best with, but also with staff able to say, no, I can't take part in this because it's too difficult for me.
Of course. And finally and briefly, Neil, if you look at everything from ICU beds to, to protective kit, et cetera, on a scale of 1 to 10, where is the NHS today in terms of its ability to deal with this crisis?
Oh, I think quite high, really. And funnily enough, an awful lot of the NHS at the moment has geared up in a way frankly, that nobody, I remember being interviewed at the start of this and saying, look, the NHS can flex. And the response was, well, yes, it can flex when there's a bomb going off and it does something special, but how do you expect the whole system? The reality is we've created, in effect, 50 new hospitals. We've quadrupled the number in places, quadrupled the number of intensive